Thanks so much for joining us, Claire.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Just so our listeners can get a sense of the work that you were doing for Labour, can you fill us in a bit about what your role was in the Leader of the Opposition's office, and also how you think the party changed over the course of time that you were there up until this point? Because I suppose you started that job when it was simply about rebuilding the party following that huge defeat under Jeremy Corbyn in 2019.
Sure. So I started in April 2020 as Keir was elected leader. And of course, it was after that defeat that you referred to in 2019, which was so devastating for Labour, and morale was obviously incredibly low. And it wasn't just the scale of that defeat, it was it being our fourth election loss. And so therefore, being able to be part of that really from the beginning to the start of this year has been a tremendous privilege, actually, and a huge opportunity. And I, of course, am receptive to all of the feedback that Keir gets as leader, but I think he has taken us from the most astonishing position where morale, as I say, was on the floor. We were 26 points behind in the polls. And really, he has, and the rest of the politicians around him have picked the Labour Party up from where they were, have given Labour its confidence back, has reconnected it essentially with working class voters and the wider electorate, and now looks as though it needs a serious programme for government because it is being considered as a party for government, and that is a tremendous success so far. But of course, that's only part of the picture. The rest of it is still to come.
And all the questions now, like you say, because they seem to be in a position where they are a government in waiting, are about their policies. What would they actually do in power? And you were Executive Director of Policy. I wonder if you could give us a bit of an idea of what that role involves and sort of what you make of how the policy agenda is shaping up so far.
So my role, as you say, was Executive Director of Policy, and that was for the Labour Party. So you're employed by the Labour Party, and we were situated in the Leader of the Opposition's office in Parliament. And at the time, it was quite a small team. We were obviously transitioning from a Labour Party as it was. So there were lots and lots of staffing changes, as you can imagine. And really that early period was couple of really important things. One was on the policy front, was to make sure that we were directing policy where we wanted it to be. And that for us was about making sure it was absolutely rooted and grounded in the Labour Party that Keir was elected to deliver, which was one that is grounded in the experience and interests of working people. The other part of that was obviously to provide staff leadership in that context. And particularly, remember, we were at the start of that pandemic. So we were starting a role and forming a team in the context of a pandemic where you couldn't be together. And us being the types we were, being recruited by Keir Starmer, there were no parties. There was no breaking of the rules. We were having to form those relationships over Zoom. We were having to manage some pretty difficult stuff, actually, and doing that at a point where we weren't together physically much of the time. So that early period was really characterised by both that big organisational transformation that Keir and the team were undertaking, but also looking out towards the country to say what is the right kind of opposition leadership here in the context of a pandemic, which the public were very clear they wanted to see parties pulling together. They were not interested in party politics as usual. They wanted to see the parties putting the national interest first. And I think every step of the way, that is what Starmer did.
I remember that push and pull of constructive sort of criticism and trying to, expose some of the mistakes that the government was making even at that early time. And let's talk about that policy agenda then, because there's been some conflicting sort of narratives about what kind of Labour Party Keir Starmer is leading. Various commentators have suggested that it's actually quite a conservative, small c conservative agenda in terms of sort of playing into patriotic framings, but also specific things like being hardline on strikes, accepting the sort of Conservative Party's framing of the economy with very, very strict fiscal rules, very similar to those of the Chancellor, as well as other sort of more cultural things, perhaps rowing back on some of the trans rights reforms, as well as not having a particularly different agenda on immigration and asylum policy, versus the idea that actually Labour's platform is more radical than you think, with the green agenda trying to mimic what Biden's doing in the US, as well as quite big stuff on workers' rights, sort of overhaul of workers' rights. Where do you sit in those two assessments, and is that too simplistic, a sort of binary?
So I think the most important thing is to do at this point is to look at the missions that Keir Starmer has set out. That's the most informative thing that people can do, to look at what does the Labour Party stand for and where is it heading. And I accept that there's much more detail and more retail offers that we would expect to see down the track. The missions are true to where Starmer wants to take the country, which is that he is someone who thinks very strategically, thinks long term about what it is we need to be mobilised as a country to do. And I see in those missions him talking not just to government policy and politics, but also there's a really clear signal there to businesses, to devolved governments and to citizens too, to say this is what we as a country need to be mobilised behind, and these are the policies that then flow from that. So in terms of, is it a radical agenda, is it small c conservative, I think it's much more about really serious reforms. I think it's pretty fundamental reforms to the kind of business model we have. If you take Rachel Reeves's speech to a think tank in DC recently, where she talked about security really being the bedrock of what you have to do now in these incredibly challenging times to secure not just household incomes, but to secure your supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's far more helpful to think in terms of this being a bold reforming agenda, but the way that is done is to go with the grain of the way people experience and think and feel policy. And by that, I think that Labour thinks much more about how is this going to affect the average family or the average person sitting round their kitchen table, adding up their bills over the course of the month, their wages, how is it going to impact on them? And I think all the talk of kind of radical and transformative, that doesn't necessarily speak to those voters. So I think it is something which is really serious about reform. I think it's about getting underneath some of the problems that we've had, the root problems that we've had in the economy. But I also think it's done in a way which is absolutely with the grain of where most people in this country could see the political leadership taking it.
That's really interesting, because I suppose there is a bit of a tightrope to walk between, the country wanting change. A lot isn't working in this country, not just the fact that, people are struggling to pay their bills. There's a lot of examples of public services that are failing, and also, our railways, for example. So people do want big change, but I suppose when you're feeling so precarious financially, you don't want something that can make things worse. We saw that what happened with the mini budget under Liz Truss, for example. So is it about walking that tightrope in terms of how you talk to voters?
I think it's being really strategic about the choices that you make and when you make them. So people clearly want change. I mean, everybody is desperate for change. I mean, that is what Sunak is up against, is people want change. They've seen what the Conservatives have done and they do not want more of it. They're not conserving very much. They are actually making the country, people are feeling worse off, and they are worse off. So we understand that message. That is different to promising a massive agenda of lots and lots of different types of change. So I would go back to saying, fundamentally, I think the politics have the ability to transform the country for the better. But I think you have to take it in stages, and you have to do policy and enact policy in ways that are going to change people's lives for the better. And you don't do that by layering on lots of language and policy which might be contradictory and might create lots of upheaval. You do it in ways which are long-term plans. This is where we want to go. And that's what Starmer's doing in setting out these missions. He's saying, this is where we want the country to head. And then he has work to do in his programme for government preparation. What do we do in the first 100 days? What are the things that we do? What are you going to feel different at the end of that first term? Those are the sorts of considerations. So for me, that is not a small c conservative agenda. I think it's quite an exciting agenda, but he is not prepared to disrupt the everyday experience that people have by doing lots of things that actually create a load of byproducts of policy that are not helpful to them. Let's do things which are actually going to transform things for the long term rather than threaten the stability of the economy. So it's a cautious reform, if you like.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you talk about layering on those policies. Labour's often accused of not having enough policies, even by Labour MPs and political commentators, even though they've got quite a lot of policies. But I think there is a sense that people don't feel like they've got a picture of what those policies would add up to, if you see what I mean, under a Labour government. And do you accept that criticism? Do you think there is a bit of a gap there?
I think some of that's fair, because I think if you look at it, I certainly see, I mean, obviously in my role I will be looking out for policy, but I certainly think that Labour's got lots to say. If you look at housing and planning, employment rights, they're really emerging with a green energy agenda. Some of that stuff that's coming through, I think, is really potentially quite important. They've actually also done a huge amount on law and order and on crime and justice, violence against women and girls. So they're really filling in lots of that kind of policy landscape. But I think what a lot of is being reflected back from voters is, what do you stand for? What's going to be different? And then MPs saying, well, what's the retail offer? Now, if we were 2 weeks to a general election, I might be a bit more worried than I am now. But my expectation is that the team have set out these big overarching missions. I think the speeches that sit behind the missions are really important, because they're where we're spelling out the argument and the case for those missions. I would then fully expect there to be more detail, including retail style offers. I'm not surprised that I haven't seen that yet.
Right, okay. Yes, because you talked about retail offers sort of coming down the track further later on. Just so our listeners know, actually, what is a retail offer? I think you've used the phrase kitchen table economics, which comes, I think, from Australia. But basically, it's the idea of policies that touch people's lives day to day. Right?
Totally. Yeah. And that's not what the missions. That's not my understanding of what the missions are there to do. The missions are not there to be replicated on a pledge card. They're to say to us, this is where we want the country to go, and to, as I say, galvanise and mobilise businesses, civil service, civil society and citizens and devolved governments into saying, this is where we want to go. Because often what's being said back to the Labour Party is the public policy environment for many of those different groups has been so volatile. They need that sense of certainty of where they're going. But that isn't the same as saying, we are going to increase the minimum wage by X. We are going to give you universal free childcare up to this point. Those are the sorts of things that you would hope and expect that Labour candidates would be able to be talking to voters about directly. And as I say, I'm just not surprised that they haven't launched a pledge card, what could be anything like 18 months before a general election.
Yeah. So the centre-left seems to be bouncing back around the world after a sort of grim decade post the financial crash. I'm thinking of Australia, Germany and the US, but there's other examples too. You've just got back from Australia fairly recently. What do you think UK Labour can learn from the sort of centre-left revival around the world and examples that you've been looking at?
We are certainly seeing that centre-left parties, from a low point after the financial crisis where some looked like they wouldn't survive at all. There are some countries where centre-left parties are being re-elected, but I caution that because the right-wing populists and the right-leaning parties are certainly strong in many countries. And even if not strong, the politics and the root causes of why they came to prominence in the first place have not gone anywhere. If anything, they probably speeded up in the last few years. So certainly we've got obviously Biden in the US and in Australia. The New South Wales government has just been elected, and so both at federal level and at state level, apart from Tasmania, everywhere in Australia has elected the Labour Party. So we were really interested in finding out, well, what is it we can learn from the elections of centre-left governments? And there is still a really big challenge that actually finding a sustainable majority when you're got this fragmentation everywhere. So it's not just in this country. If anything, our two-party system holds some of that together more than it might do in systems where there are other options. Finding sustainable coalitions is really difficult because society is much more fragmented and more complicated than it was. So what's the centre-left agenda that can really bring people together and provide that kind of broad-based coalition? So we're certainly finding that some of the policies in the programme that the Biden administration have been leading on are being replicated elsewhere. So this sense that particularly post-pandemic, the idea that the state can just get out the way and the market will come to our aid, it's never been the case, but it's certainly not the case in an era where you've got pandemics, a war in Ukraine and further geopolitical instability, but also technological developments, further disruption and so on and so forth. So there is a sense that actually having centre-left parties that offer more of that pride in what the state can do is part of the offer. Biden has obviously made this bold infrastructure push in the United States. The Australians too have done not quite as big a push on it, but they've also done an investment in the people and places that are building and making things again. So I definitely think there's a sense of it's not the same state. It's not the same. The state is back, but it is definitely a sense that centre-left parties who have got a more adaptive way of looking at how you can actually get the state to work. So that is part of what I think we can learn. There's also some things we can learn in terms of strategy and campaign tactics. The Australians were really clear on this phrase I really liked about kitchen table economics, that that's what they had to do in 2022. So in 2019, they lost the election from a really strong lead. So they had a really big lead in 2019. A lot of expectation, a lot of media saying, well, what are your policies? What exactly is your plan here? Lots of detail. They promised a variety of tax changes. But by 2022, they felt that some of that had overwhelmed their platform, that they hadn't been able to clearly communicate to you what is the difference that a Labour government's going to make to your life, to your family's life, to your community's life, and therefore took really that lesson that they needed to be much more streamlined, much clearer. And obviously they went on to victory in 2022. So we're looking at some of what the Labour Party here can learn from that.
That's so interesting, because I remember in 2019, I mean, there was so much more going on in that election, but something that Labour activists said that harmed them on the doorstep was so many policies coming through centrally. Every day they were getting new leaflets or new sort of lines to take that they were having to tell voters. And actually that was making some voters confused, even if they liked some of the individual policies that were out there. You've been grappling with this idea of how you keep that traditional coalition of working class voters and sort of more liberal left middle class voters together for these kind of parties. One of the issues is perhaps the sort of more culturally right message that Conservative parties have, and the culture wars are clearly something that this government is going to try and use coming into the next election. How should Labour sort of confront these kind of campaigning messages? Because they can be quite appealing, because often they sort of sound like the sort of common sense position.
And they're not going anywhere either. I mean, you can definitely see Sunak using those sorts of tactics, even though it doesn't quite always sit right with him. It's certainly something that he's using sort of a bit in Australia, but in the States, I mean, they're very, very caught up in what we'd call sort of the culture wars and so on. In terms of how you combat it, I think the centre-left has to have its own story on culture, to not put our heads in the sand and think that we can somehow talk to people about economics and therefore everything else will go away. Yeah. I think it's really important that we have our own confidence story about culture. And I think that we've done it before. It's our version of what this country means. And actually, whether people voted for Brexit or not, we are having to redefine some of what that means. So therefore, there is an opportunity to be able to talk about what it means to belong in this country, that is an inclusive, positive, forward-looking vision that actually can bring people together. Some of that I've seen Keir Starmer do already. I mean, I think he had to do some very clear lines in the sand around defence and security quite early on. I mean, this is not something that comes as anything other than second nature to him. He was very clear early on that that's where he stood. So being in tune with where the public is, I think, is really important. That's not the same as taking everything from just what public opinion might tell you to do. Those things are subtly different. You absolutely can lead people to a place where public opinion move steadily in a progressive direction. So you look at all of the kind of social inequality gains that we've had over the past 20, 30 years. Those have been as a result of effective arguments being made and won. But you do it by making people feel part of it, not by alienating them. And that's part of what parts of our movement need to find, that tradition of persuasive political communications, not the one that alienates people.
And just lastly, I mean, we always have these kind of voter groups that come up in elections. So Stevenage woman, I think, is the latest one that Labour should be targeting. But in general, there is often this image of the working class but aspirational perhaps apolitical voter, and these are the people that both of the parties are fighting over. Do you think that demographic is that important, and how much do you think sort of Labour is appealing to that sort of version of voter, if you like, at the moment?
Like most people, you sort of slightly cringe at some of the descriptions, and then when politicians use them in speeches or they themselves describe them, you think, it's like literally the thing that sort of turns voters off completely. But I think the sort of really important point is there basically is not a path to a parliamentary majority without winning today's working class voter. And that is fundamentally a different picture to the one that there was in the past. Like, it is more likely to be female. It is more likely to be a she in Stevenage. It's not just this sort of red wall voter that's a traditional working class voter, a sort of man in the north of England. It's a much more modern version. It's much less homogenous than it was, much more likely to be, it's multi-ethnic, it's much more diverse, more likely to be working in service industry. So I don't love the characterisations. I get why they're needed and you need a language for them. I think what's more important is that the Labour Party remembers constantly that there is no way they're going to get a parliamentary majority unless they win working people over, and under Keir Starmer's leadership, that is actually where they're heading. So that is to say, you have to unite that coalition that includes those more sort of liberal-leaning middle-class voters. So I think you can find an agenda that builds common ground rather than appeals to one over the other. But if you constantly prioritise the agenda of the liberal middle-class Labour-leaning voter, it might make you feel good, ain't going to get you into power. And there is a way we can do it, and it's what Keir's leading now, where you find your roots back with working class voters, but you draw in that Labour-leaning, more middle class, and there is a route there for Labour to win.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire. That was really fascinating.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.